For the last 2 years, I've been plagued by the ghost of my husband. At first it was comforting, but over time, he's become a nightmare. The pale woman seated beside her on the couch looked extremely upset as she spoke, but all Killian could focus on was the itch on the back of his neck. There was always an itch when you met with this sort of client, and he had to force himself not to look at the mirror just to his left. He knew what he would see there, but the feeling of vertigo that always came with it was extremely unpleasant. Seeing someone who wasn't you staring back was always a little odd. Killian had possessed Vayances before, but it always seemed strange to wear someone else's skin. The pale man stared at his wife with real scorn, and she shuddered as his regard fell on her like a snowdrift. "That's a lie," he said, his voice croaky but still full of malice. "This," he ground his teeth together before letting his rage get the better of him, "woman has stolen the only thing I have left. She continues to take from me, and there doesn't seem to be anything that I can do about it." Killian sighed and took out his notepad. As a police officer, he had spoken to squabbling partners before, solving domestic disputes and finding the problem party. As a detective, his job was to determine who might be a problem amongst the concerned parties. It wasn't uncommon for the parents to be responsible for a missing child, and the ability to sense who was cheating on whom was helpful. This, though, was a little bit different. His work with the agency often exceeded anything he'd ever done for the force in his life. "Hey," grumbled a voice in his head, "you want to hurry up? It's a little cramped in here with the two of us taking up space." Case in point, his Vayance was getting claustrophobic.
"Sorry, Rain. Just need a little more time."
"That's great and all, but there's a surprisingly small amount of leg room in the back of my own subconscious, so if you could hurry up, I'd really appreciate it." Killian nodded before realizing Rain would have no way to see it. Renoir Dupree, Rain to his friends, was a part-time Vayance and a full-time psychic. Rain was one of only a handful of humans who knew about the agency, and most psychics, the real ones at least, had a working relationship with them. You see, when that old lady in the headscarf has her eyes rolled up to the white so she can channel your great-grandma, what she's really doing is requesting information from the agency and having that ghostly bureaucracy check to see if she has the clearance to know that level of the unknowable. Neat, huh? Instead of actually talking to your relatives, you're just talking to some old mouthpiece who's using the afterlife to keep the cogs turning in an endless stream of paperwork and misinformation. The trade-off for having the information fed to you as you pretend to be a vessel for the spirit of somebody's great-gram-gram was that you actually had to be a vessel for spirits from time to time. The agency tasked these mediums and psychics as Vayances, so we could move around in the real world, and it was dead useful sometimes if you had to interact with the living world. This allowed the agency to solve problems like this one without tipping off the living. Hence why Rain and Killian were working on a ventriloquism routine in the living room of the recently deceased and his wife. Killian wasn't sure why he had been sent. This was something a junior investigator could have handled, and was a little outside of his pay grade. Still, Killian didn't have much else to do these days, so he'd agreed.
"What seems to be the problem?"
Killian licked the tip of his pencil before he began writing, and could feel Rain shudder a little inside his own head. "I left behind an unfinished manuscript when I died," the pale man began. "After my husband died, I worried that his legacy would be unfinished," his wife cut in, and Killian realized that the two couldn't hear each other.
Wait. Let's start with your names."
"I'm Rayla." "And I'm Mark," the pale man added, but Rayla looked at him strangely. "Wait, can you see him?" Killian smirked.
"Well, of course. How else would you expect this would work?"
"Of course," Rayla said with a laugh. That makes sense."
"Why don't you start, Mark?"
The pale man nodded and began. "I left behind an unfinished manuscript when I died. I've been writing installments for a certain series for years, but just as I was finishing the 5th book, I died in my sleep from a massive brain aneurysm. I was stuck here, my business unfinished, but the longer I lingered around the apartment, the more I came to understand what I could do. I figured out that I could influence Rayla through her dreams. I told her how she could get my manuscript and send it to the editor so the series could be completed up to that point. With the manuscript wrapped up, my business would be concluded, and I could move on."
"Except that clearly wasn't it."
Rayla nodded. "After that, I expected he would leave. I knew he had other books in mind for his series, and offered to help him make the full series a reality. In truth, I wasn't ready to lose Mark. After all, he he was my husband. I enjoyed getting to spend a little more time with him, so we started writing another book. Mark had a lot of ideas, and after 6 months, we had the first draft to send to an editor. He loved it. He was so glad to see another lost book in the series, and I was glad to see him happy. Mark would occupy me as we wrote, and I could feel how happy he was with the work and the completion of his dream. Mark had intended there to be 9 books, and I suppose he would leave after finishing his life's work. Killian turned to Mark, and the gaunt man nodded, looking torn by the sentiment. At first it was fine. Better than fine. It was great. My wife had never been an active part of my writing, though I got the feeling she was curious about it. It was the only aspect of my life that Rayla wasn't a part of, and helping me write seemed to make her feel closer to me. Killian watched as that ghostly pale hand slid over to touch his wife's arm, and as the pale skin touched hers, Rayla flinched away as she looked at the empty place on the couch with trepidation. The flinch seemed to reignite his anger, not something terribly uncommon in spirits, and when Mark turned back, all the love that had been present was gone. Then she changed my story. He was suddenly furious, his face seeming to twist as the anger flashed beneath the surface. Killian understood why he was sent out now. The agency didn't just send facilitators out for no good reason, and this man's rage was something frightening. Spirits, as a rule, were not supposed to experience strong emotions. They were like static images, inhabiting a space until their energy was expended. Most people couldn't make a ghost for more than a couple of 100 years, something that likely felt more like a span of years to the ghost, and couldn't do much more than flicker the lights or a little low wailing. Most hauntings were little more than your poor old Uncle Phil telling his great-grandniece that he was tired of keeping up with the Kardashians. Guys like Mark, however, were a little different. Mark had a purpose, something that was dear to him, and he felt that his death was untimely and unfair. He was already bubbling with confusion and desolation, and now whatever was happening here was pushing him towards undiluted rage. Ghosts, Killian had come to understand, were like toddlers. They didn't have a wide spectrum of emotions, and were mostly limited to mad, or sad, or happy, or jealous, or something else that was easy to define. Any of these could be dangerous, since spirits were mostly made of emotions, with just a little bit of soul mixed in to make the process even murkier. That scene in Ghost where Sam pushes the guy who murdered him, that's almost impossible for your average spirit to accomplish, unless he has a whole lot of emotions behind it. And guys like Mark almost always did. Murder victims, honor students, and creatives with a high opinion of themselves were usually the bane of Killian's existence. Killian turned back to Rayla, feeling silly as he played mediator in what would otherwise be a one-sided conversation.
Mark says to change his book. Apparently, he's not a fan of the revisions.
Rayla looked confused for a moment, before huffing out a breath and rolling her eyes. Oh God, is he still on about that? Turning to the empty space, empty to her at least, she would have been quite a bit less shouty if she could see Mark's face. His teeth were skinned back like a wolf preparing to bite. It was one time, Mark. I changed one character. Are you still hung up on that? Mark looked ready to bite, and the bulbs began to pulse in their sockets. Killian realized this might be a little deeper than a simple revision. One character? One character? He shouted, ethereal spittle spattering unnoticed on her cheek. You left Elizabeth Maker alive. Elizabeth Maker was supposed to die in Book 7. She was never supposed to exist after the fall of the Lupercalia Council. The two had been unknowingly having a shouting contest, but when the first bulb popped like a firecracker, Rayla flinched and looked around surprised. Killian elaborated on what her husband was saying, and Rayla cleared her throat, some of her bluster evaporating as the lights continued to strobe. Yeah, he wanted Elizabeth to die at the end of Book 7, but I didn't want to kill her. Killian looked at his notebook, rain grumbling in the back of his head as he tried to make sense of all this.
You'll have to excuse me, we don't really get new releases at the agency, so don't be offended when I ask, what the hell are you two talking about?
Mark and Rayla looked equally as astonished at Killian's naivete. Have you never heard of the Lines of Succession? Rayla asked.
Can't say as I have. Work keeps him pretty busy. Is it popular?
It's only one of the most prominent fantasy series of the last 3 years, Mark said. I was in talks with AMC and Showtime for a series, at least before I died. Geez, Killian, you've never heard of Lines of Succession? Don't get out much, do you? Rain said smugly from the back seat. Killian ignored him and pressed on.
So, why didn't you kill off this character if Mark wanted her dead? He's writing the book, so then shouldn't she be dead?
Elizabeth Maker isn't just some character. She's the love interest for Maxim Niles. Mark intended to sacrifice her in order to bring the Temple of the Fang down on the heads of the Lupercalia Council. He knows that Elizabeth is my favorite character. Hell, the fans love Elizabeth too, and he knows that. Her sacrifice was symbolic, Mark shouted, Ryla stuttering as her breath came out in a puff of smoke. It was meant to push Maxim to fight the Shadow Pack to avenge her death in the 8th book. Now he has no real motivation to fight the Pack. He won't even know about the Pack Lord, and he won't find his honorable death at the end of Book 9. You've ruined everything! Another bulb popped, and Rain began to whimper from the back seat again.
Okay. So why not just rewrite the story so you can have the ending the way you want it?
Killian was hoping to calm Mark down before his anger overtopped him, but this turned out to be the wrong question. Because she sent a copy of the manuscript to my editor against my wishes, Mark screamed, practically vibrating off the sofa as he shouted. He kept sabotaging the manuscript. He did something to the computer so I couldn't use it, and if it hadn't been saved online, I'd have had to rewrite it. So I sent it to the editor from an internet cafe, and I'm glad I did. They like the fact that she survived. The fans like that she survived, and the book has tested very... But she stopped talking when the first book rose up off the shelf and pelted towards her. Killian barely ducked another one, and soon the air was full of flying missiles. The books and knickknacks on the shelves, the magazines on the end table, had all begun to flash around like lawn furniture in a tornado. Killian reached over to pull Rylea away from Mark's ghostly form as it began to float off the couch. The two of them backed towards the corner, Killian grabbing a TV tray as he knocked the books that chased them out of the air. As Mark floated, his pale skin became an ethereal green. Rayla gasped, her eyes growing wide as Killian realized that she could see him too. Rain was gibbering, asking little questions in a high, panicked voice, but Killian turned him way down. This was why they had sent him. The agency knew that Mark was getting ready to go nuclear, full-blown poltergeist, and they needed someone to talk him down, or to take him down. Killian may have been able to do just that, but he didn't think the agency had known how short Mark's fuse was. Mark could be saved, just like a certain little girl Killian knew had been saved, but he had to act fast. There was a storm brewing, and it threatened to drag Mark into the vortex. Killian stepped out as the wind whipped at the cuffs of his ridiculous purple shirt, his TV tray still held at the ready if something should come flying his way.
Mark Gabriel Francis,
Killian shouted, seeing him shudder as the power of his full name fell upon him.
I know you're angry, but you're in real danger if you keep this up.
Mark was standing at the center of a swirling whirlwind. One of the bookshelves fell over, the last of its books now circling in the storm, and the gray ottoman seemed to be hanging by its peg legs. The wind swirled with papers, knickknacks, books, and other small items that the growing tornado had picked up. Mark's eyes rolled to the whites, and Killian saw them run with bloody tears. Blood ran from his ears and nose, too, likely the way he had looked in death, but he was no more ghastly a creature than some of the others Killian had helped.
You're on the cusp of becoming something terrible. Don't let your anger make you a monster.
What choice do I have? She's ruined everything. She's ruined my vision. I can't let her get away with this. She cannot be allowed to live. She can't be allowed to taint my ideas any further. Killian ducked another book, a heavy tome that would have likely laid his Vance out, and tried again.
I know you're angry. There's nothing worse than dying without closure, but this isn't the way to get it. If you give in to your rage, you won't be able to pass on. You'll be stuck with nothing but the candle of your emotions, just waiting for it to burn out and leave you in darkness.
Mark laughed, and the sound made the window shudder in the frame. Then what? Hell awaits me? I don't believe in that. Don't try to preach to me. I'm beyond such things now.
There are worse things than hell, Mark. Hell is many things to many people, but there's a darker void for those hell won't take.
A paperback crashed into Killian's shoulder, but it was all the response he received. Mark hung in the center like a terrible eye to a building storm, and even his name had no effect on him now. As the cutlery flew out of the island that separated the kitchen from the living room, Killian took a step back and rejoined the huddled widow. Rain was bemoaning that he had ever signed up for this crap and praying to God that if he ever got out of this situation, he would return to church and find a job that required fewer dead people to occupy his head. Killian wanted to tell him to shut up, but he felt a little like praying himself. This was getting dicey, and his options would be limited pretty soon. Killian touched the little .38 in his pocket, feeling secure with the knowledge that it was there. It wasn't really a .38, no more than any of the other weapons manifested by the members of the agency, but it was Killian's source of power and his only means of attacking spirits. He would have to exit his veyance to use it, but he doubted Rain would mind much. Something rankled him as he thought about the gun, though. The voice said it wasn't time for that yet, but soon there would be no other choice. He looked at Rayla and yelled over the typhoon.
If you want to talk to him, now would be the time. We're almost past the point of being able to save him.
Rayla looked undecided as she hunkered in her corner, but Rain's shouts told Killian flatly that that was a bad idea. Are you crazy? He'll kill her. She's the source of his anger. He'll rip her to pieces if you send her out there. Killian thought about that, taking Rayla by the shoulder and asking something he should have asked from the start.
Did you have a good reason to save Elizabeth?
Rayla looked disbelievingly at Killian, but the nod that came in the wake of his question told him that he was on the right track.
Then go tell him that.
And if he kills her, Rain asked, your agency won't like that one bit.
Fuck the agency. They wanted me to handle this. I'm handling it. Rayla.
Killian spoke out loud as he shook the scared woman a little to gain her attention.
This may be your last chance to talk to your husband on this side. If you need to tell him something, now's the time.
Rayla looked past Killian, and as she got to her feet, Killian was reminded of a newborn giraffe he'd seen at a nature show once. Each step seemed to be less sure than the one before it, and as Rayla approached Mark, that terrible figure turned to look at her. Mark, she half whispered, a fillet knife missing her by an inch as she shrank to her knees. Do you know why I spared Elizabeth? Because you never understood my work. You always resented that I put it before anything. You blamed it for us never having children, for the fights we often had, and ultimately you blamed the stress for my death. Rayla had to shift a little to avoid several paperbacks that ruffled the back of her head. It was because I knew how it would make Maxim feel, she yelled, and some of the items that had been prepared to careen into her stopped midair. She looked up at Mark, his face surprisingly inviting, as it enticed her to explain. I thought about that broken man. His love ended in the pursuit of his quest, and I remembered how much it hurt to lose you. Your life was over, but I was left behind to figure out what came next. I reread your books after the funeral, consuming them all in the space of a week. In a way, they became like the children we never had. They were the only pieces of you I had left, and I cherished them. When you came back to me, inviting me to help you finish your work, I felt closer to you than I had our entire marriage. His eyes had unrolled, the blood fading from his face as she spoke, and as Mark floated back towards the couch, the items in the whirlwind hung frozen in place, like planets caught mid-orbit. In a way, these new books were our children, born from your mind and my effort. I cherished them all the more. When you told me to kill Elizabeth, though, I knew I couldn't. She was too important to Maxim, and I didn't want him to know the loss that I had felt. I didn't want anyone to feel that loss. I didn't want to feel that loss ever again. When he wrapped his arms around her, she pushed against him as if he were flesh and blood. The items dropped around them, knives thankfully falling to the carpet as opposed to into anyone made of meat, and Killian fetched a deep sigh as he realized it was finally over. Tell your boss there better be hazard pay involved in this, Rain said, clearly not sharing in the fuzzy moment that was going on around them. I was never warned that my body might be in danger while you guys use it for your little walkabouts.
Just soak it in, Junior. These are the little wins that are few and far between.
Killian smiled as the two reconciled quietly, understanding that it had almost gone very badly, and feeling grateful that she had managed to turn it around. Would you really have shot him? Rain asked. Killian watched them, the glow coming off them like a space heater in mid-February.
I've shot people I liked a lot more than him. and it's my job to put down the monsters when they burst out of their human form. Luckily, tonight that wasn't necessary.
Killian hoped that a return trip wouldn't be necessary either. Perhaps the two would find a way to finish Mark's legacy without the need for agency intervention this time.
Come on, Rain. I think our work is done here.
Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Well, I hope you enjoyed that performance by the Baron Landred, and of course, yours truly. I was so inspired by his last reading of a Killian Barger story that I decided I wanted to write another one. In fact, I was deciding that I might want to write a whole book about it. I'm currently working on what is part 1 of, I'm hoping, a long series about Killian Barger and his ghost detective adventures, so you can expect to see quite a few more Killian Barger stories in the future. If you enjoy the tales of Killian Barger, or any of the stories that we do here, I recommend that you subscribe. Maybe go ahead and hit that notification button so you don't miss any of the great stuff we do here. If you haven't noticed yet, I also do a weekly poll on Friday through Sunday, so come on in and vote for your Friday story. I have quite a few. I've been a real busy boy lately, and I have quite a few stories to choose from, so come on down and vote for your Friday story and hear what you'd like to hear. Before we go, let's thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet and the Irish Devil for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle, Emily Coltsfoot, and Xaronana for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks to everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to support the show, then come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can get your Spooky a day early on a Tuesday and a Thursday, and have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I do. There's a new link below that you might notice to my Vocal page, so if you haven't read any of my written work, come on down to Vocal, where I actually get paid a little bit when you read, so come on down. I'm beginning to develop a little bit of a community down there. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.